Hey folks, this is Ardwulf. Welcome to episode 2 of our series of How to Wargame with GMT's Paths of Glory. This episode we're going to focus on Paths of Glory's sequence of play, and we're also going to zoom in to a couple parts of that sequence and discuss how you win the game. Before we start, I should mention that this video and future videos are going to be a little dense, so feel free to pause and rewind if you need to. If you have a copy of the game, you can follow along with the physical pieces. Personally, I find that helpful. Before we get started, I want to mention that like many war games, Paths of Glory has a number of different scenarios that you can play. Now, some war games don't even have a campaign game and are basically all scenarios. Advanced Squad Leader, Combat Commander, other tactical games are examples of that. Here we have 3 scenarios, and we'll talk about this later. We have an introductory scenario that only lasts 3 turns, a limited war scenario that lasts until the war escalates to total war, and we have the campaign game. There's also a historical variant that has optional rules and a slightly different setup. Each scenario has its own individual considerations, but we'll talk more about the details of Paths of Glory's scenarios in a future video. In general, though, this series will be discussing the campaign game. The other scenarios are variations on that. The sequence of play is the place to start learning almost any war game. Some rulebooks do a better job than others at explaining how everything hangs off of that skeleton, but fortunately Paths of Glory's rulebook is pretty well put together. As I said earlier, any war game is going to have a sequence of play in which things happen each turn in a specific order. This order is usually very important. It's easy to forget things until you have the hang of the sequence of play in your particular game, so you should follow it very carefully for your first game. Paths of Glory's sequence of play is laid out on page 6 of the rulebook, and it's pretty straightforward. There are only 7 different phases. First, we have the mandated offensives phase. In this phase, we determine which countries must attack during the turn, and if they don't, they'll lose victory points. We'll take a closer look at that shortly. Next, we have the action phase. In this phase, this is where the meat of the game happens. During this phase, we play cards, move units, conduct combats. We will talk about that in greater depth in the next episode, episode 3. In the attrition phase, we check supply. We check to make sure that units are in supply, and we remove those units that aren't. Again, we'll talk about that later. During the siege phase, phase D, we roll to resolve sieges of fortresses, and we'll be covering this and attrition in episode 4. Next comes the war status phase. At this time, we check war status, victory, and war commitment level. We'll talk about this in a little while. The replacement phase is divided into allied and central powers subphases or segments, and this is when we spend those replacement points that we have accumulated to replenish depleted units that are on the board, to rebuild destroyed units, and to bring new units onto the map. The drawing strategy card phase, we refill our hands. We'll talk about this in greater detail in the future as well. And then lastly, we have end of turn, which really isn't a phase. It tells you that the turn's over and you move the turn record to the next turn. Before we get into the other stuff, let's talk very briefly about how you win a game of Paths of Glory, because that's kind of important. So the general records track that's printed on the map board is used to track 3 things: victory points, replacement points, and war status. Each nation has its own replacement points marker. Here's the German one, here's the British one, and those points are tracked individually by country. And we'll get into what you do with those later. For now, let's look at victory points and therefore how you win a game of Paths of Glory. The short version is that when the game ends, you check the victory points. High victory points is good for the central powers. Low victory points is good for the allies. So the victory points really only track how well the central powers are doing. And at the start of play, victory points start in the 10 space. So there are 10 victory points as we begin the game. So, how does the game end? Well, it ends in one of 3 ways. First, if one side wins an automatic victory, this is only checked during the war status phase, which we'll talk about in detail later this episode. If the victory point tally is 20 or more, during that phase, the central powers win an automatic victory, and if it is 0 or less, the allies win an automatic victory. Second, the game ends if an armistice is declared. Now, this happens when the combined war status, and we'll talk about this later on, is 40 or more when it's checked during the war status phase. If it hits 40, everyone is exhausted and the war ends, and we check victory points to see who the winner is. The exact numbers of victory points that are needed to determine who the winner is are determined by scenario. So for the campaign game, that depends on whether the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk card has been played. That represents the Russians coming to terms with the Central Powers as a result of the Russian Revolution. And the third way that Paths of Glory ends is if time runs out. Now, the scenarios end on a specified date or under specified conditions. The campaign game runs out in the war status phase of the winter 1919 turn, so it actually can go longer than the war did historically. And again, if time runs out, victory is determined based on the current victory point total, which again depends on what scenario you're playing. Remember, you only check for victory during each war status phase, and we'll talk about that phase next. War status is also tracked on the general records track and reflects the war's escalation level and the commitment of each side to continue fighting. It is tracked independently for each side, but you also track the combined war status, which is a prerequisite for some events and can end the game if it reaches 40, as we discussed earlier. The war status markers are moved up in response to playing event cards. This number on the card, in parentheses after the card's name, is how many points we increase that side's war status by when the card is played as an event. So, for example, if we play the Guns of August as an event, which we can see can only happen in the first action round of the August 1914 turn, we would increase the Central Powers war status to 2 from 0. And therefore we would increase the combined war status also to 2 because the Central Powers are at 2 and the Allies are at 1. If at a later time the Allies play an event that increases their war status by 1, we would increase the Allied war status to 1 and the combined war status would increase to 3. During the war status phase, we do 4 things. First, we make any changes to the game status that occurs during the maintenance each turn, which happens during the war status phase. Exactly what adjustment you need to make is stated on the event card that you've played that necessitates that change. Second, we need to check for automatic victory. We've already covered how to do this earlier in the episode, but again, if VP is at or above 20 or below 0, then one side has won an automatic victory. Third, we check at this time to see if there is an armistice. And again, we declare that an armistice has occurred if the combined war status is at 40 or more. Fourth and last, we check the war commitment level for each side. Importantly, we skip this step in the first turn of the game for August 1914. At the start of the game, only the cards marked mobilization are in each deck. And during this part of the war status phase, if one side or the other has achieved a higher war status, so we can see that limited war occurs at war status 4, then we take the limited war cards in that eventuality and shuffle them into the deck. So the Central Powers deck just got a lot bigger. Once the war status reaches 11, we take the total war cards and shuffle those into the deck. So we've increased the size of the deck substantially as the war status increases. The two sides can be at different war commitment levels at any given time. So in this scenario, for example, when we check war commitment level, the Central Powers is at 6, but the Allies are only at 3. So at this time, we would shuffle the Central Powers limited war cards into their deck, but we would not yet shuffle the Allied limited war cards into their deck. And we won't do that until we reach limited war and we check it during the war status phase. Lastly, let's zoom into the very first phase of each turn, the mandated offensives phase, and see how that works. During the mandated offensives phase each turn, we need to roll for each side to determine which countries, if any, must conduct at least one attack that turn. Now, each faction has its own table for this printed on the map. Mandatory offensives represent offensives mandated by the political leadership or by existing military doctrine like the French Plan 17 or the German Schlieffen Plan. The procedure for this is very simple. Each side rolls 1d6, and the table tells us which nations need to make mandatory offensives. If a nation fails to make its mandatory attack, then they lose 1 victory point for their side. For the Central Powers, this means that the victory point marker moves down by 1. If the Allies don't make their mandatory attack, the victory point marker is increased by 1. Once the mandated attack is made, we move the marker to the none or made space. So, for example, if we roll a 4, we see that Germany needs to make a mandatory attack this turn. Now, if the result is a nation that is currently neutral, as Turkey would be in the August 1914 game turn, or if the result is none, then no one on that side needs to make a mandatory attack. They can, of course, choose to attack if they like. If the nation that's rolled has its capital occupied by the opposing faction, then that nation does not have to make a mandated offensive, but the marker is shifted 1 space to the right on the track, so some other nation could come up instead. Now bear in mind that Austria-Hungary has 2 capitals, Budapest and Vienna, and both of them have to be captured for this rule to apply.
German mandated offensives have to be against British, French, or American units on the West Front, so they have to be in France, Germany, or Belgium, or they don't count. If the Hindenburg-Ludendorff Take Command card has been played, however, you ignore all German mandatory offensives for the rest of the game. And if the Hoffmann card is played, then you add +1 to all future Central Powers mandated offensive die rolls. Turkish mandated offensives have to be against allied units. The Senussi tribal unit, which is a Turkish unit, does not count for making a mandated attack. Austro-Hungarian mandated offensives can be against any unit. However, if the Austria-Hungary and Italy in parentheses result is rolled, then they have to attack on the Italian front against Italian units, spaces in Italy, or other allied units tracing supply through Italy. And we'll talk about supply in detail in episode 4. British and French mandated offensives have to be made against German units in France, Germany, or Belgium. Now, the Portuguese, Canadian, Australian, and Arab Northern Army corps do not count, just like the Turkish SN Corps. Attacks made by these units do not count against the British mandatory offensive. If the French mutiny card has been played, then the Allied mandated offensive marker is flipped to its French mutiny side, and the French mandated offensive is not required, but any French attacks that do happen have additional limitations unless they're stacked with American units. Russian mandated offensives are ignored once the Bolshevik Revolution card is played.
That's a wrap for episode 2. We have covered a lot of the rules of Paths of Glory in this episode, so feel free to rewatch if you need to and take your time. Tune in next time for episode 3, where we will cover actions, including card play, movement, and combat. Be sure to leave any questions or comments below, like the video if you're enjoying watching, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to stick with the program. Thanks for watching.